Hey,
Hey,
Jeremy.
how's it going?
Hey, good. How are you?
Pretty good. I'm gonna rename myself. I don't know why I always default to Jeremy Blaney. Jeremy Tableau. All right, there we go. All right, ready for this?
Yeah,
Cool.
I think people are trickling in. I'm not sure the official start time.
And so, are you, Mark, going to be facilitating this then, or is that going to be? We met with I met with a few individuals yesterday, and it seems like that's what was basically going to happen today. Um, Sorry, I'm still getting myself set up. Yeah, yesterday I met with Terry, and then I'm forgetting Mr. King's first name. I only remember
Right.
King. Yeah, exactly. And he mentioned that like somebody's going to join us today to sort of like facilitate this using like one of the network views that have been created. Is that your job, Mark?
My job is more logistics stuff, making sure that people get let in and checking
Okay.
in chat.
Okay.
That sort of thing. I'm double checking with Terry now to see if that's the plan.
Cool.
Yeah, it sounds like Dave will be facilitating sort of the structure of it after the presentation.
Perfect.
A few more people joining. Now that it's 10:15, it looks like people are filing in.
Hi, Jeremy. How are you?
Hey, hello. How are you?
Good. We'll
I'm wearing
just
my I Love Data superhero shirt.
perfect.
I tend to do for all presentations.
That's great. So we'll just give people a couple minutes to join, and then what I'd like to do is maybe in 2 or 3 minutes, I'll just give a little announcement to whoever's joined that we're recording the session. I'm doing that before each session. And then I'll turn it over to you to give a little recap of the talk. We did use the morning sessions to tell people to go ahead and watch the talk ahead of time, and we just gave them a break to do so. So I expect that people will have watched it. And I see that there's some sparks that have been entered about it. So that'll be our basic flow, and we'll get started in just a couple minutes.
Fantastic.
I'll turn off the waiting room so people can just come on in. I'll share my screen and we can see some of the sparks that have been entered. Here's one. Seems to be a lot of overlap between Viz Responsibility presentation and Jeremy's work at Tableau and what Kim Gallen is talking about in Black communities. So that seems interesting. And how have we standardized performance measures that show progress towards visualizing things responsibly so we can know how effective our strategies are to combat misinformation. So while we're waiting a couple minutes for people to join, you can think about these, Jeremy, and I'll help to facilitate a conversation around it. And this will be one of the views that we'll use to help to make sure that that conversation keeps going based on the concepts that you have, your talk has, and different people are bringing to the conversation.
Great. Looking forward to it.
Great. All right, let's give people 2 more minutes to come on in. All right, well, why don't we go ahead and get started? Maybe you can do let me just remind everybody we're recording the sessions. I talked about that in the morning. And Jeremy, why don't you go ahead and just give a little intro and you can tell us a little bit about the topic.
Yeah, for sure. So, hey, good morning, good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you're dialing in from. My name is Jeremy Blaney, and I'm super excited to be with you here today. Just a bit about me. I currently lead a team of customer success managers at Tableau who essentially operate in a post-sale capacity. As long story short, when customers go big with an investment in Tableau, we obviously want to make sure that they're successful in that effort. So we assign customer success managers to basically help them, realize the vision that they have for data and analytics within their organization. I haven't been doing so much of my day job for the past 6 or so months. Really what I've been focused on more so is helping organizations all around the world across all industries and sectors think through how they can use data to respond to the coronavirus pandemic. That effort has been, really interesting for just a number of reasons, and hopefully everybody got a chance to listen to the talk, so that way I don't have to unpack too much of it. But in the event that you didn't, I'll just provide a quick little preview about what it is that what it is that I talked about. In short, rewind 6 months ago, coronavirus, and sorry, I've got a very antsy dog who's like staring out the window looking at all the squirrels coming out for the fall. So forgive me if you hear somebody growling or barking in the background. It's not my children, that's my dog right here. But anyway, rewind about 6 months ago or so, coronavirus was beginning to make a splash on the United States. I happened to be in Seattle at the time, which is where Tableau's headquarters is. A couple of us got together in the room and said, hey, we think data is going to be critical in responding to coronavirus. We'd like to help companies think through that, but we don't really know what that looks like. The last thing anybody wants in an emergency situation, in a humanitarian situation, is for somebody to just sort of come up with these artificial ways of helping. That doesn't do any good, right? It was about that time that I happened to get a call from a friend at UNICEF, and he said, hey, we're getting ready to survey all of these country offices around the world to get a better sense of like how children are being impacted by COVID-19, the socioeconomic impacts, as it were. Can you help us out with that? The visualization, the cleaning of the data, and so on and so forth. And I said, sure. So as we jumped into that use case, we wanted to do a pretty simple thing. We wanted to take that survey data, we wanted to overlay it with publicly available coronavirus case data. And that sounds like a pretty easy thing to do, right? For those of you who aren't new to Tableau and those of you who are new, it's pretty easy to take two different data sets and combine them together. But we actually had a really difficult time doing that really simple thing. And that's because at least back then, only a couple of organizations were publishing this, coronavirus case data to the web, and, the way in which it was formatted and sort of, the holes that it had in it. Maybe it had some dirty data, maybe it had misshapen data. It just made it very difficult to do what it is that I just described. We had to work through that pain for this UNICEF use case. And so we thought, like, why don't we do that essentially on behalf of, every organization around the world, so that way they can, more easily make use of this as a part of their own coronavirus response. And that's really where the journey began. Once we created, that curated data stream, as it were, we decided to go a step further and create some starter solutions that allowed people to more easily make use of that curated data stream. And then at the same time, we realized we needed to, put this all in a central location. So that led to the creation of the COVID-19 Data Hub. And it was about that time, as I said in the talk, that, a number of people began to, visualize coronavirus case data. And we saw a lot of good things come from that. And we saw a lot of, bad things, hyperbolistic things come of that. And so we, started partnering with, experts in this field, so that way they could help us appreciate how best to visualize responsibly in the face of a public health pandemic. That journey, as I said, is one that we've been on for about 6 months now. And I wish I could say that there's an end in sight, but really there's not. It seems like every moment that we come out of this, that we're on the downward slope, things change. And suddenly, cases are skyrocketing once again, as we are seeing right now at different places, both around the United States and around the world. So let me stop there. That's just like a quick down and dirty preview about what it is that I talked about on the video. Let's stop there, and maybe I'll pass it back over to you, Dave.
Perfect. No, perfect. Thanks for adding a little bit of flavor to what you recorded. And let me start with just kind of opening it up for questions. Is there anybody in the group that had any questions that came up as they were watching Jeremy's presentation? And that if you don't ask some, I'll go into the cognitive network and I'll start picking on some nodes to get the conversation going.
I had a question I'd be happy to start with. So
yeah, go ahead.
One of the things that kind of struck me as I was watching the video and thinking about kind of like my own background in data science and statistics is there's a famous book, like How to Lie with Statistics. And I'm curious, like, there's a lot of, misinformation and wrong information out there around coronavirus.
Yeah.
And I wonder how much of it is just like with statistics, it's a different way of thinking about math. And a lot of times, like these data visualizations, it can be a different way of thinking about data. And I wonder where the line is between like the how to lie with data visualization versus just, oh, look, this map of coronavirus exactly matches 5G coverage, but it's complete, correlation, not causality at all. So
Yeah. No, it's I mean, you don't need to look too far to find examples of that happening here in the United States. I think, most people remember the unfortunate situation of the woman who was working for, I think it was the state of Florida, or maybe it was the Department of Health in Florida, where, she was being asked by certain officials to basically doctor the numbers to make things look better than they actually were. And you're totally right. That's absolutely possible to do, right? You trim off a little bit here, trim a little bit there, maybe color things in a way that doesn't, elicit as strongly of an emotional response, which is sort of like one of the values of visual analytics, right? And lo and behold, the situation is much better, than it,
change your
would have
axes
been.
labels, or
Exactly. Yeah. So you don't need to look too far to find examples of that. In fact, we actually invited, and I'm forgetting the name of her. I'm forgetting her name at the moment, but we actually invited her, to be a guest speaker on a vlog that we run. It's called If Data Could Talk, and the woman, as well as like our chief evangelist Andy Cockreeve, had a really rich conversation talking about this very thing. And so, I would highly encourage people to, I guess let me figure out how to like get you that link, but I would highly encourage you to read it, because it's like an hour-long conversation about what it is that we're talking about. But yeah, I mean, short and sweet is, you're totally right. I mean, it's absolutely something that that needs to be top of mind, not just as we're like building visualizations and making use of data. We have a responsibility to do that, responsibly, right? But also when we're looking at visualizations, to look at it with a critical eye, and I'll just sort of leave it at that, right? Look at it with a critical eye and try to understand methodology and that kind of stuff.
Before we, move on to a different question, part of what I want to do is see if I can really facilitate a conversation across the whole group, not just a back and forth with Jeremy. So this question that Kent's bringing up around, you can lie with statistics, you can mislead with data visualization. Anybody else have their own experience with this or perspective on this?
I think I shared, some of the same questions. There are so many times people have asked to use our lab to do network visualizations, and ultimately we just hide the shaggy bits. That's they don't want a network visualization. They want an attractive one that tells the story that they want it to show. And even in the graph that we have here on the screen, how do you balance out that I'm showing you the data versus I'm telling my story with the data? That's a very difficult self-imposed border to maintain.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll jump in there, because you called out the graph that's being shared, and I think it's actually a good example to maybe take a critical eye to some of the sort of subtle visualization channels that are being employed to absolutely be editorial, not to be objective. So for example, the people are bigger than all the other nodes, and that again is that's a design decision to try and put the focus, on the people in the conversation. I think that, Jeremy mentioned color. The sparks are colored differently than, they're intentionally brighter than the other things. They're trying to bring your attention to that. Both of those things that I brought up are not necessarily, so egregious, but here's one that's I think a little bit more incipient, which is that the nodes are all the same size. They're not sized by the number of connections that are going into them. And, what that does is it actually creates a false representation of equality, which in one perspective might be desirable. Like, we made that decision because in facilitating a conversation, sorry, they're doing some construction across from the office. At least the leaf blower guy isn't here. But in facilitating a conversation, I sort of want, for example, the the humanities, which is a node just connected to 3 people, I want it to sort of take the same amount of visual space as data science, which is connected to almost everybody, so that it, people might talk about these different topics. But, it doesn't really represent a level of the dimension of the data that's there. And it's absolutely it's my editorial that's being subtly kind of superimposed on all of your consciousnesses, right, through the process. I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts.
I'll just add something briefly. In the early days of the coronavirus pandemic, most of the cases when you looked at the world as a whole were, in China, right? And so when you plotted, every country's line, as it were, most sort of tracked one with another. And then you had China, this massive line sort of overarching them all. And so what do? Do you leave the visualization like that? Or do you introduce like a logarithmic scale to, create a visualization that maybe is easier on the eyes, and, frankly, easier on the real estate, or just maximizes the real estate that maybe you have available on the screen. The moment that you do that, you obviously need to, go a level further and explain what it is that you did on that particular visualization. But I mean, there's always going to be people who don't read footnotes and email us saying, hey, what's going on here? I just saw in the news last night that China has far more cases than the United States has, yet these lines are tracking pretty close to one another. I think something's wrong with the underlying data. So it's a very real issue that we had to work through, and many organizations are still having to work through today.
Hey, Dave, this is James. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Chime
good.
in with some thoughts.
Yeah, hi everybody. I think this topic's extremely interesting on a macro basis and also around the pandemic as well. But and I'm curious of what y'all's view of this is. When I think about visualization of data, that there's two, and the use of the data, that two things come to my mind. And I've worked with executives on producing visualizations of data, and I think this, the concept of what are you seeing and what's the truth behind the data is important. And so two things come to my mind. One is I think of things, I always try to drive them to be purpose built. So I think of things saying, okay, well, what am I trying to, what's the message? What am I trying to convey here? What am I trying to get people to understand? And then you can kind of try to filter out the noise around that and focus on making that point. And so to me, that's one way of thinking about visualization. The other one is, to me, is clearly the exploratory piece of that says I've got data and I've got tools. I'm looking for discovery and insight, and I'm just going to drill through data until I try to figure that out and get to that discovery point. So I don't know. It's just a couple of thoughts on the topic, and interested in anybody's feedback on that. And I apologize for my background. I've got an awful background back here compared to all y'all's nice backgrounds.
No problem. Something that you mentioned when you talked about sort of purpose-driven and exploratory visualization, I frequently think about visualization from both an exploratory perspective and an explanatory perspective, and that those are not the same things, and that sometimes, in order to decide what we think, we use exploratory visualizations. We come to some realization, we make some discovery. That experience is kind of so powerful oftentimes that we think that then sharing that same exploratory visualization is going to help people have the same powerful experience of the discovery, when in reality, they're not going through that process. So you need a different type of visualization to explain, what it is you found when you explored. Jeremy, I don't know if you see this or have your own thoughts on this with your experience in this space.
Yeah, so in addition to working at Tableau, I teach some courses on data analytics and data visualization, both at Tufts University as well as the University of Texas. And I tend to break down the how to visualize data lecture, as it were, into two parts. The first part is around principles of visual analytics. So let's just understand like pre-attentive attributes and how things like length and size and color, what have you, can help us better understand or help us more quickly understand whatever a data set is telling us. And then I move off into the next part, which is, okay, now that we've talked about sort of visuals at a very micro level, let's talk about, how visuals work together when we, put them together on a micro level, like in the form of a dashboard. And usually that lecture talks a lot about, I have a very annoying dog today, and usually that lecture has a lot to do with the intent of the dashboard, right? Like what is it that you're looking to do? Are you looking to give somebody the ability to, maybe understand a slice of the problem and also go 9 levels deeper and discover some insights on their own? Or are you simply looking to tell a story and then that's that? And maybe there's a world in which you're doing a little bit of both. Right now, I'm supporting some efforts on the island of Hawaii with mask distribution. In short, there's about 200,000 residents on the island. The goal is to ensure that every resident has 5 masks at their disposal. So 500% goal, right? And I stood up some dashboards for the county of Hawaii to do that a bit more efficiently. They can go onto these dashboards and they can click around to see what part of the island have they hit and what part of the island have they not hit. But then this dashboard also, informs insofar as it can be provided to the public, and they can see like, this is what my government is doing for me. Thus far, for the past couple of weeks, they've distributed about 200,000 masks. So, purpose, I completely agree with the comment that was made that you need to think about the purpose of the dashboard, of the visualization that you're creating. But it doesn't need to be like a one or the other. You might be able to find a way in which you bring together multiple purposes into like a single visualization.
Other questions or thoughts for Jeremy based on what you either saw in the recording or heard so far?
I think it'd be interesting in the perspective of what is for the producers of these dashboards, right? What is the moral responsibility? And you mentioned, adding it in footnotes or Dave, you kind of explained the lens of your curatorial decisions. Mm-hmm. What is the moral responsibility of us as people that distribute this data to produce those type of, explanation of that lens? And if we put it out there, do we find that people are even trafficking that at all if the idea behind the visualization is to kind of get a snapshot?
I certainly have a perspective, but I'd love to hear from the others.
Anybody else have thoughts on that before Jeremy dives in?
I definitely feel like we have an obligation to include those sorts of things that add nuance and detail, but it's equally important to me that the snapshot picture is not built to editorialize, to sell the story to a point that it distorts things. Like it's kind of balancing both things.
Let me just ask a question, Mark, because I clicked on your node. So you're in here under software development. Do you see any aspects in sort of responsible software development relative to, we've been talking specifically responsible data visualization, but are there aspects of this at play in just responsible software development?
Security jumps in my mind, of course, but with visualizations, it's nothing immediately jumps out.
Mm-hmm. What about
like building the ability to build visualizations?
On that thread, what about the inclusion of like footnotes from a software development perspective? And maybe I could, share just like a quick anecdote. So Tableau is owned by Salesforce. We were acquired about a year ago or so. And Salesforce, ever since the pandemic, really took off, has developed and released this suite of applications called work.com. And so in short, I mean, there are these different applications that are just designed to help, private sector and public sector organizations lead through the crisis and get back up and running as fast as possible. There's a lot of data visualizations in these work.com applications, and in any application, I guess screen space or real estate is pretty limited. And so that begs the question, what do you do with these all important footnotes? Do you sacrifice a little bit of the real estate so that way you have it right there, like accompanying the visualization to just help everybody understand what's going on? Or do you bury those footnotes like in other parts of the software package, as it were, like in terms of service or whatever?
Yeah, it's an interesting observation. I think that, when we broaden from data visualization to software development as a whole, it seems to me like it pulls in all of these additional decisions that get made and sort of the justifications for them. And, you're bringing up ones that are kind of visible, even if buried, like you sort of have a footnote. But it also strikes me that a lot of algorithms that are running these software tools are kind of hidden and don't necessarily have any footnotes about what they're doing. We don't necessarily think of our news feed as a data visualization, but if we understood more clearly the extent to which it was filtering what showed up in our feed, there's decisions being made there that's similar to some of the ones we're talking here about what to accentuate and what not. So I don't know. That's where my brain goes with that, and don't know what other people think. There's a few people we haven't heard from. So Pamela or Gianvito, Emily, any thoughts on what you're hearing, or any different questions for Jeremy or others?
This is Emily. I have a comment on the last conversation, which is that I saw some work from the Wikimedia Foundation where they're making their algorithms transparent for how they're boosting. What if you make this change to this article, this is what will happen to it, right? So it gives you sort of the if then. So I find that kind of work really, and I don't think it was an easy decision for them, because if you can see it, then you can game it. But I think they decided it was the lesser of the evils. So I've been following that with some interest, and I think that has some relevance to what we're talking about here in terms of what do you make visible or at least available. But my question is actually more about visualizations driving actions. So assuming you've got the sort of transparency bit solved, quote unquote solved. If we're sort of in agreement that these are the kinds of actions we're trying to inform, and we're in agreement that what the kind of relative value of those actions is, from psychology, we know that actions are very emotionally driven, and data visualization tends not to be, and in fact sort of like intentionally stays away from trying to be too emotional. So I find in my work, we build data visualizations mostly for nonprofit organizations, and that they're always asking, so what does this mean? What do I do because of this? And we're sort of like, well, that's up to you. And that's very unsatisfying for them, right? So like, I'm curious about the relationship between data visualization and sort of narrative emotion. And one of the reasons I've always been super impressed by Tableau is because of the historical connection to Pixar, which is like all emotion. And so I'm interested in some thoughts on data visualization and emotion. Thanks.
I certainly, does anybody else have a thought? I have a thought, but I want to, I'm trying to find an image really quick to share here in the chat window.
You can even, if you want, I can let you take over the screen share if you want to just pull it up. Or I can pull it up too.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, yeah, give me 2 seconds. Sorry. Um,
Okay.
Here, I'll drop it. I'll just drop it in the chat. Yeah, if you want to go ahead
Yeah.
and click on that there, Dave. The rather than just sort of like answer your question outright, maybe I could respond like with a question of my own. Is you look at these, data visualizations, like what sort of emotional reaction do you have to them? Thinking about specifically the left one versus the right one. They're the exact same data, between the two of them, right? I think we're looking at the number of people who have died in the war in Iraq over the years. And then it, breaks it down by province and so on and so forth. So it's the exact same data between the two visualizations, but there are some notable like visual differences between the two, between the use of color, the use of text, as well as, the use of position, right? On the left-hand side, the scale is reversed, so that way, the red, sort of like blood, is dripping down from the ceiling, rather than, on the right-hand side where we're sort of viewing the data as we, typically would, right? Going from 0 to whatever number along the y-axis. I think, data visualization very much can like elicit an emotional response. Whether you want to or not, that's sort of like another conversation altogether. But I definitely think, data visualization has the ability to elicit an emotional response.
There's a thought that's kind of being generated for me on this, which is Emily used the word narrative, if I'm remembering correctly. My ears kind of perked up with that, because I think that we don't often integrate that, or maybe as intentionally integrate that into some of our design work as I think we could. What stands out to me here are the titles. And I think that, the narrative, like that's the first thing that I sort of really took away, Iraq's bloody toll versus deaths on the decline. Like the narrative is telling me what to think in addition to the visual elements. And one thing I see with people doing data visualization is they're often hesitant to tell people what they think they should think about the visualization. And personally, I think that's a mistake. I think that there's a bit of an illusion of objectiveness, that there's this idea that just because it's data, these are the cold hard facts, but those cold hard facts, even if they are, cold and hard, were not generated in a vacuum. There was an intent behind why you collected them and why you're presenting them. And I feel like sometimes it's better to be explicit with those assumptions so that someone can take issue with it if they want, but anyway, that's part of my perspective on this.
Yeah, and I mean, it brings us back to what we were saying originally. Which approach is more responsible? Is it to view the cold hard facts on the right-hand side where deaths are on the decline, or is it to, zoom out and look at the situation as a whole and, take a stance and to present it in such a way that draws a conclusion, which is a lot of people died throughout the wars in Iraq. I mean, which is more responsible or least responsible? It's a hard question to answer, but it definitely reminds me of when I was an undergrad at Michigan State. I participated in this undergraduate research symposium where myself and a couple of colleagues talked about, truth being subjective, and, our whole theme was around, or our whole presentation was around, like, media, bias in media as it relates to the war in Iraq. And the individual who, was judging or grading our presentation was a history professor. And he just gave us terrible marks because he's like, truth is not subjective. What are you talking about? Truth is truth. History is history. You possibly can't, believe that it's subjective when, you can kind of see that it totally is, right?
Emily, thoughts? I mean, your question, I think, brought this kind of rich discussion. What are your thoughts on what you've heard so far?
Yeah, I think, well, the piece about narrative, that was an intentional drop, so I'm glad you you grabbed that. I think it gets to what you were just saying, Jeremy, about like sort of everything, not everything is subjective, but like to sort of be conscious of our subjectivity. And I think I personally, just putting my own subjectivity into the picture, I would like to see more data visualization designers kind of embrace a narrative bent to what they're doing, not necessarily from an infographic. When I look at these two visualizations here, I think of it more as like an infographic kind of approach. And I think you definitely see a lot of narrative in that kind of work, but even from a exploratory tools kind of perspective, I remember I was very excited about like the story feature in Tableau, but I never really quite figured out how to use it that well. And
Nobody has
yeah.
sort of the features that Tableau has.
So conceptually, I really like that idea of like giving people tools to construct stories in an exploratory fashion that, like, I guess it goes back even to what you were saying about if you have this great exploratory moment constructing a visualization and then you just give the end product to somebody, they're not going to have the same experience you had. So sort of taking someone on a data exploration journey that is intentionally subjective, right? It's meant to tell a story, but that you can have the kind of narrative experience of like, oh, like I thought this, but this is actually what's happening. And that's what storytellers do, right? It's very intentional. It's not just like, oh, this happens and this happens and this happens. Like there's conflict and there's tension and there's resolution. And I think those kinds of frameworks can be much better used. And I'm always searching for the examples. I mean, they exist. I got into data visualization because of Hans Rosling's TED Talk, which was very much one of those kinds of like data stories. But it just doesn't seem to be a prominent design principle when you're in rooms of like a bunch of data nerds.
I do have just a quick thought about, something that you said. You were talking about sort of designing with the intent to act, and how you'll often build data visualizations or what have you, pass them off to people, and then they say, "Well, great, but how do I make use of this thing?" There's a woman by the name of Anya Ahern. She's a Tableau Zen master. A Zen master in Tableau terms is just sort of like a community leader, somebody who, goes to great lengths to help people appreciate sort of the power of data and analytics and visualization and all this other stuff. She developed a workshop that is meant to walk somebody through a process by which they can design a dashboard or a visualization or what have you that is meant to do exactly that, help guide them to make a decision about whatever the subject is. This workshop is something that she and I delivered for the UN compound out in Nairobi, and I've done it with all of my students in all the courses that I've run since, and it really works out well. The whole premise behind this workshop is, first and foremost, you need to align on sort of like a purpose and then walk through a couple of steps, none of which involve technology. They just involve like pieces of paper or whiteboards or what have you. And only when you get to the end of this, then do you open up a laptop and try to actually like create a data visualization after it. I dropped the link to Anya's blog on this workshop. From the time that we ran it for the UN in Nairobi. It's something that I would, highly encourage everybody to just have a read through.
Thanks. This is great. And we'll capture some of these resources that you're adding in the conversation. We'll also add them as nodes in the Cognitive City connected to the talk. So we'll be able to see the additional resources that got brought in. And, speaking of sort of additional things being brought in, I noticed we've got a couple people that joined a little bit later in the talk, and Nafisa, I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing the name correctly, but I noticed that you're connected with this concept of field work. And I'm wondering if there's, if you have any perspective on the conversation, because it seems like one of the things we're talking about is how a visualization can be kind of divorced from the data perspective, can end up being a bit divorced from the implementation. Anything you want to add or any questions you want to ask to the group? Or anybody else? Yeah, Jeremy, thoughts?
Well, and I was going to say, and maybe going a level further, how do you do what we're talking about in a remote environment? I was just reading your bio there, and it looks like that you work in Afghanistan with refugees or work for an organization that specializes in Afghan refugees. Some places I imagine of which are like quite remote, right? So how do you do what we're talking about where, maybe resources are scarce and connectivity isn't as strong as it is, here in Washington, D.C.?
Any thoughts? No obligation to chime in, but I think, it's a nice opportunity to have representatives from the field that are really working on this in a setting different than many of us. Would certainly be curious to hear any thoughts. I have to walk a fine line in being a facilitator and not putting people on the spot too much, even though I'm very curious. Gianvito or John, Pamela, Mark, Mark, I've seen you nodding your head a few times in the conversation. Any thoughts that have been generated for you or questions you want to bring up?
This is John. I do have one. And obviously, it has ramifications at multiple different levels, and that's really what is the quality of the data? And you certainly look at things like social information and misinformation that's out there, and putting that aside and focusing on science, where so many papers can't be replicated. How do we find some way of being able to identify kind of outliers as opposed, as we read information, how do we know if it's correct or not, and particularly as we synthesize it? I don't think there's an answer, but that's one of the things that's been going through my mind as I've been thinking about visualization and the whole conversation about not misrepresenting information. Anyway, just one of the random thoughts that I've been thinking about.
It's bizarre how many small mistakes are made, in producing data sets. Just like one example, the European CDC, every single day they publish out, their coronavirus case numbers for all the countries in the world. And their data set isn't particularly big. It's like 5 columns, how many new cases, how many new deaths, what is the country name? And then there's, the 3-letter code as well as the ISO 2 code, right? And for the United States, the 2 code would be US, the 3-letter code would be USA. For the United Kingdom, what do you think the answer is for the 2-letter code and the 3-letter code? Is it, GB and GBR, or is it UK plus, whatever, I guess the 3-digit of that? Well, the answer is it's GB and GBR, but the EU CDC doesn't produce that. They have in the 2-letter code, the UK, and in the 3-letter code, GBR, which is just wrong. Like, it's just wrong, and it's bad data. And why they're still doing that, 7 or 8 months into this thing, I have no clue. If we can, avoid making simple mistakes like that, or even correcting simple mistakes like that, think about all of the other mistakes that are being made when, the situation is far more complicated than that. So you're right. I mean, one of the interesting things about COVID is it's just put, this idea of data-driven decision-making and how critically important data is, and just, making effective decisions that allow us to move forward from here. It's just put that at the front and center of everybody's mind and every organization's mind. And that's a really good thing, but it's also a really terrifying thing, just because of, now that it is at the front of your mind, you got to actually do something about it. And that's not, something that can be done without technology investment. And that doesn't need to just be like a Tableau thing. That could be a Tableau or Microsoft, a Click, or whatever thing.
I'm going to want to wrap things up to give people a little bit of a break between sessions, which is also a way to let people watch the next session video if they haven't already. But before we wrap up, let me just, provide one more opportunity. If anyone's kind of been sitting on a question or a thought that they want to get out before we wrap up, feel free to chime in now.
One thing that just struck me about the two images about deaths in Iraq is just the way that it's often presented, where we want to separate like being a craftsperson doing your job well versus like the morality of the story you're telling. And I think in both images, they did a great job of kind of reinforcing the story, but it's still kind of connected to that larger story of what you're telling. And there's a certain level of responsibility there.
I think this is a nice concept to end on, sort of bringing it back to responsibility, which was totally, where Jeremy started. I think if we look at the sparks that got generated, and I didn't bring them out specifically because they're generated by someone who's not in the call right now, but these are ones that we can keep in mind as we go to the other talks and as we get back together as a group. Looking at the overlap between the talks that are happening today. So, visualization responsibility and what Kim is going to talk about in Black communities, and thinking about partnerships between Tableau and other organizations like COVID Black. I think it's exciting to think about how, you talk about purpose driven, think about a company with sort of a horizontal technology like Tableau, then being able to partner with organizations that have particular purposes. I think it's a model we really want to get good at, not just for Tableau partnerships, but for all the companies that have these sort of general tools that can help other people with specific purposes. And then this is another question around standardized, or this spark is about how can we have standardized performance measures that show progress towards visualizing things responsibly. And I think this kind of maybe speaks back to Mark's point, which is if this is something that a segment of people really want to be conscious of, can we create some standards that we hold ourselves to, and for example, if we had those standards, would we be able to assess in some way the left or the right version of this chart and be able to say, for a set of criteria, we think this one is more or less responsible than the other? So I encourage you guys to think about these ideas. When we take a break, you can also enter additional sparks. If you go to the conference page in the Cognitive City, you can. John is going to give a talk at 1:15, so in another 12 minutes, and I'll be doing this. He and I are sort of tag teaming that one. So if you haven't watched that talk, that's here, and you can watch the video here. Kim's talk is also next. So if you're curious about that spark, about what Jeremy is talking about, what Kim's talking about, you can go to that session and see what she's talking about. So let's take a 12-minute break. It gives you a chance to watch anything if you haven't, enter sparks if you haven't, or just clear your mind. And then we'll see you in the next sessions at 1:15. Thanks so much.
Thank you all.